Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, China. This city is called Shenfu, and it's just one of hundreds of ghost cities dotted across the country. We'll look at how all this building could be hiding a mountain of bad debt, and what would happen if China goes through a full-blown banking crisis. Also this week, Emma Walmsley's been named CEO at the UK's biggest drug maker, GlaxoSmithKline. But she's an exception. Women captured less than 3% of new CEO positions globally last year, and new figures show the gender pay gap is still wide as well. Why, in 2016, is workplace gender equality still a goal rather than a reality? And unlucky number 7, you're banned from using your Samsung Note 7 on some planes. The 7th Apple iPhone's having a problem with its headphone jacks. We'll look at what's what with phones and with virtual reality. You know, so much has been said and written about the great Chinese economic slowdown. We knew it was coming. So it became about adjusting outlooks and expectations, both for China and for the rest of the world. But there are growing concerns the world's second largest economy is headed for a major crisis, not because of the slowdown, but because of debt. That's our focus this week, the risk of a banking crisis in China, where years of building and spending sprees have led to mounting debt. Steve Chow starts us off with this report from Shenfu.
In the heart of the city of Shenfu is a circle of life. A 60-story, $16 million structure meant to attract tourists. The only problem, Shenfu is a ghost town. Its emptiness has come to symbolize all that's gone wrong with the country's economy.
This is what we call a rotten building. It's unfinished because they ran out of funding.
Former factory worker Meng Xijun blames officials for squandering taxpayers' money.
For people going to work in the city, this place is simply too far from everything. China is like that. People are never consulted. Government bosses dictate what they want to build, and then it becomes a mess.
What's more alarming is that there are now hundreds of deserted cities like this throughout China. According to the government, China has more than 2 billion square meters of empty residential space. That's enough to house more than 100 million people. These empty shelves have in many ways become symbols of a wild spending spree that some say has gone on far too long. Economists say a mountain of debt is rising faster than the economy can grow.
If China had been willing to give up that hyper growth, then it might have avoided the potential for a serious crash and a serious debt crisis, but it didn't and it won't.
Our government indeed interfered in some unnecessary things.
An extraordinary admission, but China's premier still denies the economy's in trouble.
We are fully confident of China's long-term economic growth. As long as we continue to reform and open up, China's economy will not suffer a hard landing.
Critics remain doubtful. They point to developments like this fake Dubai Palm Island, which cost millions to build and has since run out of money.
The economy is not getting better. I see that now. The factories are no longer thriving, and the salaries haven't gone up with our nation's development. It's all changed. How did it come to this? It's terrible.
Meng hopes China's leaders can turn things around. But after all he's seen, he says he fears for the future.
And that fear may well be warranted because, according to the Bank for International Settlements, the debt alarm just keeps ringing louder for China. We're going to discuss that now with Sébastien Mallier. He's with the Economist Intelligence Unit's global forecasting team in Singapore. Sébastien, the idea of debt in China, I think it actually has been around for a while, but it's been, I think, maybe overshadowed by the economic slowdown. Now that we've reached the point where the slowdown is very real, it seems And correct me if I'm wrong, we should really be taking more notice of these potential banking problems.
It's definitely a concern at the moment, and it's becoming a growing concern. And one thing that particularly grabbed the headlines recently was no particular development in China, but actually a data release by the Bank of International Settlements, a global financial watchdog. And in its quarterly data release, what the BIS has said is that one indicator of a potential banking crisis, which is called the debt to GDP gap, a measure which looks at the debt to the GDP ratio and compares it to its long-term trend. Well, that measure for China has hit a measure of 30.1 in the first quarter of 2016, compared with about 24 a year earlier. And the BIS says that when a country has a measure of about 10, it is at high risk of a banking crisis over the next 3 years. So there is a realization that this issue of bank debt in China can become very significant in the years to come.
Okay, so that is what the BIS is saying, as you rightly point out. What is your analysis, though, Sebastian? Do you feel that the BIS is accurate here? Are they overplaying the risks? Or maybe China really, is on the verge of something quite bad if something doesn't change?
There are certainly areas of concern. And I would say in the broader financial sector, the broader risk of a financial crisis in China can come from various directions. One area of concern for us is the property market. Property prices are rising again and are rising quite fast. And if anything happens in that sector, you could see the onset of a financial crisis. Another area is more the corporate debt, so the non-financial corporate debt, especially in the state-owned enterprises, which have huge productivity problems and huge profitability problems. But in fact, the Chinese authorities may well be able to avoid a banking crisis or a financial crisis. What we think that they won't be able to avoid anymore is a sharp slowdown in debt. Because what will happen as this realization of the level of debt in the economy filters through in official cycles, there will be an effort to tighten monetary policy and to try and curb the current credit boom. And when that happens, you will have a sharp slowdown in investment and you will have a sharp slowdown in economic growth. So in fact, it's this story of a China hard landing and a sharp slowdown in growth that we think will be the eventual outcome of these current concerns about debt.
Is part of the problem, Sebastian, that we actually just don't know enough? For example, there is the headline figure of $26 trillion worth of Chinese debt, but maybe we don't really know how much of that is public debt, how much of that is private debt, importantly, how much of that is quote-unquote bad debt. And until you get stats like the BIS ones that we've seen, you're just not getting enough hard numbers.
Yeah, the issue of transparency with Chinese data has been ongoing for years and continues to be a problem. As you say, we don't know exactly what the level of non-performing loans is. We don't know what the capacity of the central government is to take on more debt from state-owned enterprises or local governments. So there is a lot of uncertainty and lack of transparency around policy. But even from what we know, we can see that at the moment, the pace of debt accumulation and the level of debt in the economy is very high compared with what we've seen in other countries that have had financial crises. So for that reason, from what is visible, there is already a lot to be worried about.
This is a very simple final question, Sebastian, but I still want to ask it. I want you to tell our viewers about the potential global impact here, because we already know what has happened with China's, as I keep saying, economic slowdown, the so-called managed slowdown and the knock-on effect of that. But if there are further banking and debt problems like we're talking about, how is that going to affect everyone else?
The key issue here is that China is, by some measures, the biggest economy in the world. And it's very well integrated in global supply chains. So anything that happens in China will have repercussions globally. There are some restrictions on how financial problems can be transmitted abroad because of the restrictions on the flows of capital outside of China. But if we have some sort of reckoning in the financial sector, there will be a transmission towards China's real economy. And as we've seen, even with the January jitters, this kind of transmission can have an impact on all economies that export to China, so commodity exporters to from the Middle East to Africa to Asia and Latin America, which are dependent on China's demand, would suffer. And you would also see an impact on Western economies, either through a trade channel, through a confidence channel, which could hit global stock exchanges. So you could have different channels, but no single economy in the world would really be spared if we had a major crisis in China.
Sebastian Mallier from the Economist Intelligence Unit in Singapore, we thank you very much indeed for your time this week.
Thank you.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, back to virtual reality. The billion-dollar gaming industry is heading further down the VR path. We'll bring you the latest trends from the Tokyo Games Show a little later on. Now, next time you're sitting at your desk at work, think about the fact that you may be getting paid less or more than the person sitting next to you simply because of your gender. Yes, it still happens, even though gender-based discrimination in most countries is illegal. And with companies under no obligation to publish exactly how much they pay men and women in the same roles, it can even open the door for denial that a gender pay gap even exists. But the World Bank, the United Nations and the OECD all say the gender pay gap is no myth. In fact, the UN has made gender equality one of its sustainable development goals. And with the World Economic Forum estimating it'll be 118 years before women around the world can expect equal pay, it's a pretty urgent goal. And it's not just pay, it's job positions. For companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, for instance, there are still only 7 female bosses for every 100 people heading up companies. The issue's also become a presidential one over in the United States, with candidate Hillary Clinton making equal pay a large part of her campaign, pushing for actual legislation if she wins the election. So let's talk more about what can be done about pay transparency and creating fairer workplaces. We'll start in the UK, where research shows there's an 18% gap between men's and women's pay, and that only widens after women have children. Well, from the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, Associate Director Robert Joyce joins us. Now, Robert, this wouldn't usually be my first question, but I can almost see no valid reason as to why we should be even discussing this in 2016. Does it surprise you when you do this sort of research and it becomes a point of discussion?
Yes, I mean, it depends, of course, what's causing the gap. So if there's outright discrimination going on between men and women, then it would be very surprising that we have to talk about that in a big way in the year 2016. And there probably is some of that that's still going on, although there's legislation that is designed to prevent it, and there's almost certainly less of it than there used to be. Some of the gap, as we show in this research, is due to things that are less surprising in some sense, in that a lot of it is related to what women do after they have children. Namely, they tend to reduce their hours of work, sometimes leaving the labour market altogether. And often they pay a price for that in terms of the accumulation of experience they have in the labour market, and therefore the wages that they can earn when they come back or when they continue on in full-time work.
It's funny though, because you said it would be concerning if there was outright discrimination, but I actually think a lot of people would think that this is outright discrimination, paying women less in such situations. I mean, it's not guaranteed that they're all going to go off and have children.
Well, that's right. But so what happens is that women who don't have children tend not to see the same effect. They tend to see wage growth over their 20s and 30s at a similar rate to men. So in the labour market, we tend to think generally it would be the same for men as well. When people reduce their hours of work or they take time out of work, we see that they pay a wage penalty when they come back. So a man, for example, experiencing a period of unemployment will tend to find that incurs a wage scar later on because they have less experience, so they've accumulated perhaps less skills and experience that employers value. Now, what we see when we're looking at the gender pay gap is differences between the genders on a large scale in that kind of behaviour. Because of what happens after childbirth, women are much, much more likely to reduce their hours of paid work. So that explains not necessarily all, but a fairly large chunk of the gender wage gap. And so if we want to reduce it further, then one of the key areas we need to be looking at is how can we, for example, maintain the level of wage progression that people get when they're working part-time, as many women do after childbirth, so that those workers don't fall further behind their full-time counterparts. So that could be things like training policy, for example. The other area to think about is, can we get if we wanted to, we could look at having a more equal sharing of the caring responsibilities within the home, so that there is less difference between men and women in terms of what happens to their employment behaviour after childbirth. So that's the other side of the coin.
Can we talk about legislation just briefly, Robert? As I understand, by 2018, the British government wants companies to be publishing pay levels and disparities between men and women. Is that the right track? Is that enough? Because, I don't know, that doesn't feel like it could be enough.
That's a potential future policy that the government is considering bringing in. And so on top of the fact that it's already outlawed to pay men and women differently for the same work, the government is considering essentially increasing transparency further, so making companies publish more information that tell you about what they're paying the men and women in those companies. If you want to tackle those big numbers in a big way, I think you also need to look at more fundamental things that are going on in the labour market to do with, for example, why are part-time workers able to see so much less wage growth as they progress in their jobs than full-time workers? Is there any way that the wage scar for women who take time out of work, of paid work altogether, can be reduced? So those kinds of questions, I think, are perhaps somewhat harder to tackle, but we need to be looking at those alongside things like increasing transparency.
All right then, Robert Joyce, we thank you for your time and your thoughts.
Pleasure.
And now to Washington, D.C. and Catherine Hill, Director of Research at the American Association of University Women. Catherine, I'm sure I don't need to convince you about the gender pay gap, but I would be interested to know why you think there are the deniers out there. Why would people believe the gap doesn't exist when there appears to be so much evidence to the contrary?
I think that people are really questioning what it means. I mean, the U.S. Census simply states that women are making 80 cents on the dollar. For every dollar earned by a man, women are making just 80 cents. So that's not in dispute. What is in dispute is what this means. What goes into this number? Is it just a matter of discrimination? It's also a matter of the occupations, the industries, the kinds of jobs that men and women have. And the answer is that both are true. It's the choices that women are making, and it's the choices that people think women will make. So women are making choices, including taking time out to take care of their children, to take care of their elderly parents, to care for disabled people in their families, but they also want to opt back in. And the question is, there are still gender stereotypes and bias that play into how employers are paying women. People often think that gender bias is a thing of the past, but unfortunately, it's still very much with us.
Okay, so I want to go back to the choices. Basically, you're saying that women get penalized because of the choices they make. Or actually more interesting, I think it was when you said the choices that people think they will make. Are you saying there's a way of thinking that's already ingrained in employers?
Yes. There's the choices that women make, such as taking off time to care for the children, taking off time to care for their elderly parents. But there are also the choices that people are assuming women will make. So choices about taking time off, choices about the kinds of jobs women really want, the responsibilities women want to have on the jobs. So it's both the real choices, and that makes sense, but it's also these choices that employers are making for women. And that's where we see gender bias in play.
So then the question, Catherine, becomes about how to change that, I guess. You know, I've been looking at Hillary Clinton's website and the things which she wants to do if she wins. Do you think if that happens and Hillary Clinton pushes through actual equality legislation as far as pay goes, will that make the difference that you're looking for?
We know that legislation can make an important difference. So back in 1963, when the Equal Pay Act was put into place, we've seen enormous gains over time. So women at that time were making about 60% as much as men. Today, that's at 80% as much as men. So we've seen great gains, and that's something to celebrate. The bad news is that most recently, the last decade, women's wages have been fairly stagnant.
Yeah, but that just doesn't make sense, though, does it? I mean, what you said there about women's wages remaining stagnant. I mean, yeah, I said this to my previous guest. There's really no good reason for us to be discussing this. Tell me what you think. Give me your view.
Well, I can say two things about it. You know, really when we saw the gains in women's earnings, it was during the 1980s and 1990s. And that's when we saw so many more women going into college, getting their degrees, getting professional degrees. We saw women lawyers and doctors and business people. So we saw those gains, and that's when we saw women's wages going up. In the last 10 years, women have continued to invest in education, but we're not still seeing those gains in the paychecks. And part of that is not just we want women to go into traditionally male fields like engineering and computing, and they earn more when they do that, but we also want to value women's work. We are not now valuing what women are doing, like nursing and teaching and childcare work. One of the statistics that I find really shocking is that we pay our parking lot attendants more than we pay our childcare workers.
Wow.
Now, I know we care more about our children than our cars, so something is not going the way it should in our economy. Sometimes the market forces need a little bit of help.
Yeah, but you know, Catherine, when you say something like that example, it becomes apparent that we're talking about changing mindsets here. Legislation is one thing, and that can very much force an issue and make change happen, and that's good. But changing mindsets, that's a long game thing. And clearly this long game's been going for a long time already.
I wish there was a simple answer and a silver bullet which would just solve the issue, but that's not what we're going to find. In our new report, The Simple Truth, we spell out what we think individuals can do, what employers can do, and what government agencies can do. So there's a lot we all can do at the federal, state level, and even in our own lives. Negotiation workshops that AAUW holds. We also have material on our website about how women can negotiate their wages. We know women are less likely to negotiate and tend to not be successful at negotiation, certainly in comparison to men. So it's a harder sell for women. Negotiation can be viewed as aggressive or too assertive and too almost masculine. So women need to negotiate carefully and thoughtfully.
Okay, Catherine Hill from the American Association for University Women. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And Catherine's organisation has an interesting test on its website, as she was talking about. It's a sort of reactionary test to see which genders you associate with certain jobs and whether you have a bias either way. I took the test. It is anonymous, and it's very interesting as well, so I reckon you should have a look. Now to a bit of tech news, and really this month has been a challenging one for the world's biggest makers of smartphones. Samsung, first of all, we know it had to recall its Galaxy Note 7 after it turned into a billion-dollar headache. You know, exploding batteries and all that. Now airlines have started banning passengers from using their brand new devices due to those safety concerns. That, of course, may help its rival Apple gain some market share for its newest offering, the iPhone 7, even though they've got a software glitch with the wireless Lightning earpods. Controversially, the new iPhone comes without a traditional headphone jack. But Apple shares rose this week as it also said it's in the early stages of opening its first ever store in South Korea, and not just anywhere, right across the street from Samsung's headquarters in Seoul. Meanwhile, in Japan, we had the Tokyo Game Show, where virtual reality was king. Now, from the outside, well, it looks like that. But once you're inside the mask, the possibilities look pretty much endless. And so it was the big draw card for the hundreds of thousands of people who attended, among them our own Rob McBride.
Many of them are more used to a solitary existence in small darkened rooms. But once a year they are drawn together as a mass to the big darkened rooms of the Tokyo Game Show to pursue a passion for gaming. The chance to try out the latest games and the devices to play them before they're released onto high streets the world over. And as gaming is increasingly moving from this to this, Japan is one of the leaders of virtual reality.
In the previous version, I had to push a button, but now what I do is this.
Virtual reality is about to be introduced to the mass market in Japan with the release of the head-mounted display from Sony PlayStation.
A leading producer of both games and hardware, Japan is also one of the world's main consumers.
For a nation that might be just a little gaming obsessed, out of a global gaming industry worth $100 billion a year, Japan alone accounts for about a quarter of those sales.
Promising immersive thrills, virtual reality is making the insular world of gaming a bit more insulated.
I used to think it looked embarrassing, but when you're playing, you forget about your surroundings.
The rise of virtual reality comes as the world is introduced to the augmented reality of games like Pokemon Go, taking gaming out into the real world, but with the inherent risks of exercise and meeting people. Not much attraction there for these gaming devotees.
To be honest, I'd rather just sit in front of a computer and not actually move around.
Over for another year, with the masses melting away back to small, darkened rooms.
And that's this week's show, but there's more for you online, of course, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, with individual reports, links and entire episodes to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. You can use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.